Coach,
Joe, how you doing, man?
I'm doing. How are you doing? What's the weather like there?
A little chilly this morning, for AZ.
What's chilly? What's
But
chilly in Phoenix?
no, man, it'll get down there. It was the other morning, it was probably 33. That's about as cold as it's ever been, but it'll
Okay.
be, 65, 70 during the day.
Oh, rock on.
Yeah.
Okay. So
So
that I
we're
mean,
not we're not we're not hurting like the rest of the country right now.
no, no. I've been out of Phoenix now 3 times. I'm actually heading back there in a couple months, and it always blows my mind every time I go to a desert climate how hot it can be during the day, and then when it gets night, oh, it gets down there pretty quick.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. A lot of people don't get that climate shift just from day to night during the winter, quote, winter months.
Yeah, and the peak time of day for heat is like later in the afternoon than it is other places, like I'm from Massachusetts, and at noon or 1 o'clock, it's as hot as it's going to be.
Yeah.
Here, it's like 4 or 5 o'clock because the sun heats it up all day long. So
Yeah,
different deal.
what was that like? 'Cause I know you are from what my father calls the motherland, which is the New England area. It's where my
Yes.
majority of my family's from. And what kind of shift was that like going from just the culture in general from New England, Massachusetts to Arizona? Like what was that like? And then what was the temperature shift like? Like what was the one defining moment you're like, wow, this is very different.
Yeah, I think like from a weather perspective, I was in South Carolina for 7 years, so it
Yep.
was it was hot and humid,
Hmm.
and then you get out here, and I got here in the wintertime, and it was absolutely beautiful. My first summer, I think we had, I don't know, 45 or 50 days above 110. So it's
45 or
hot.
50 days
Yeah,
above
yeah,
110.
it's
Is
we're out in it,
right,
like we
right.
we're out in it, we train in it, all day, and we're a morning team, so it's not quite as hot as that, but yeah, it's hot. My whole first summer here, I had an old Toyota Sequoia, and it didn't have air conditioning.
Oh,
So
God
I
bless
went
your
through
soul.
I went through the whole summer with a car with no AC. You roll the window down, it's like somebody's got a hair dryer on full blast.
Right.
So I adapted relatively quickly.
Yeah.
Um, Culturally, very, very different.
Mhm.
Um, you know, Growing up in Massachusetts, obviously being away, but and then having that kind of 2 years back at UMass, I kind of got reacclimated to the edge
Yeah.
that people have up there, the
Yeah.
edge that I love.
Hmm.
Um, you get yelled at in Dunkin' Donuts if your order's not ready to go and fast
Right.
enough. And
Yeah.
and I sort of had that edge when I first got out here. I still do, but a lot of people kind of look at you sideways, like, what, just calm down a little bit, man. You don't need to be screaming and yelling at everybody, in
Uh-huh.
this situation. So just chill out. But other than that, it's been great.
I mean, totally random, but I gotta ask this. Now that you brought up Dunkin' Donuts and Massachusetts, I have to ask: is Dunkin' Donuts out there really as big of a deal as Ben Affleck makes it to be?
In Massachusetts?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
No,
it
there's
is.
one.
Okay.
There's one on every block.
Okay. So they
Um,
destroy Starbucks out there. That's not even a competition on the
there's
East Coast.
hardly there's hardly any Starbucks.
Okay.
There's really very, very few Starbucks. And it's funny, out here and even in South Carolina, there was a Dunkin' Donuts, and I'd be like, "Oh, I'm going to Dunkin'." And the coffee tastes pretty terrible. If
It
it's
is not
not
the
in the
same.
Northeast. Yeah, no, it's not the same. I don't know if it's the
The
water.
water, yeah.
I don't know what it is, but the Dunkin' tastes great in New England, and it's not so good out here.
Oh, that's wild. Because I would imagine a corporate giant like that would have everything prepackaged. So I think you're right. It's got to be the water.
Has to be.
It's got
I
to be
don't
a
know. I don't know
situation.
what else it is, but
Have you ever spent time in El Paso by mad chance?
just for a bowl game. We
Okay.
played in the Sun Bowl, so I was there for a week.
Did you experience the tap water in El Paso?
I think I stayed away from
You should. That was one. I was yeah. When I was down there at Bliss, I tell you that you couldn't escape. You turn the tap water on and it smells like sewage. And that's the only bad thing I tell about El Paso. I love El Paso. I loved my time there.
Yeah,
Loved Fort
yeah.
Bliss. Loved everything about it. But dude, and that made everything taste a little bit different.
Yeah, it's
Just
like being in Mexico. You got to brush your teeth with a bottled water.
always gotta do it. Well, hey, Coach, I know that Saturdays and Sundays are big family days for you, so I really appreciate you taking the time and sitting down. And I, especially after the season you all have had, where there was a postseason push as well. I know it took more time away from your family, so this makes this even more valuable. I appreciate it. I've been waiting to link up with you for quite some time. If you could just give the listeners just a 2 3 minute interlude of who you are and what your progression was from when you started coaching to where you are now.
Sure. Yeah. Obviously, you know, I've been sort of around the country a little bit, just like most coaches. I started I didn't start in the field of strength and conditioning till after I was done in undergraduate school. I played baseball at University of Hartford, and I had a great strength coach, Emil Johnson, and we trained like a football team because Emil didn't really know any different. So it was a very similar off-season structure and all that. I almost didn't realize that it could be a career at that point in time in my life. And then I messed around for a few years after that. I was a firefighter. I sold life insurance. I worked at a landscape company. I was an EMT. I did a bunch of stuff and didn't really love any of it. And then sort of had an epiphany one day, and just quit everything I was doing and enrolled in Bridgewater State University in their master's program for strength and conditioning. And that was a pretty monumental moment for me because I wasn't the greatest student in undergraduate school, but I was always sort of back in the day, reading Muscle and Fitness and
Oh
getting,
yeah, flex
books
and
on
yeah,
strength and conditioning and just trying to, better myself at that point in time and better my training for sports. But year and a half, 2 year program, master's program. Dr. Ellen Robinson was my department head and pretty much lead instructor. And it was a tremendous experience. I got to compete on the Olympic weightlifting team there. That was very competitive in New England. And she was a tremendous resource for me and a great mentor, still is to this
mm-hmm.
day. She's a savage. She was a marathon runner, a world-class Olympic weightlifter. She was a bodybuilder at one point in time. So really, really
Does it
tremendous,
all.
really tremendous human. As part of that curriculum, I had to do site visits to all the college or NFL strength and conditioning facilities around the country, or excuse me, around New England. And I went everywhere. I went to University of Maine. I went to UMass. I went to UConn. I went to URI, Boston College. And when I walked into Harvard's weight room, I was blown away. They had just moved to the Palmer-Dixon facility, which is a huge facility. It's like an old tennis arena.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really cool. And Craig Fitzgerald was there. I did my site visit. And at the end of the site visit, he's like, "Hey, would you want to intern?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm finishing up my master's program. I would love to." So we sort of hit it off right away. And I haven't looked back. I would drive. I would get up at around 2:30 in the morning because I lived an hour and 15 minutes away from Harvard. So I would drive to Harvard. I would work all day till like 1 or 2 o'clock. And if you know anything about Boston traffic, you got to get out of there
Yeah, yeah,
before,
yeah.
before 3 o'clock, something
Oh
like
yeah.
that, or else you're going to be in it for 4 or 5 hours.
Yep.
So he was gracious enough to let me kind of coach for 3 quarters of the day. The nice thing was football was at 6 a.m. So I got experience that. Um, did that for, I don't know, 6, 8 months. And then he hired me on as a basically limited earnings assistant.
Okay.
And really the limited earnings barely covered the gas.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I still went doing that. I was bartending at night too. So I'd be up till, 11 o'clock, midnight. And then I turn around and get up at 2:30 and then work all day. And I just kind of repeat, repeat, repeat. And then I was also training on the weekends at a private facility on Cape Cod. So that was kind of my intro to using some of the knowledge that I had gained to basically, create a philosophy in this business. Fast forward, CSCCA, I
Mhm.
can't remember the exact year. It was in Nashville. I stood out in the rain and was introduced to Joe Ken and talked to him for an
Okay.
hour. I didn't really speak. He talked for an hour and I listened. And then
Yeah.
he offered me a job at Louisville the next day.
Oh,
So
that's
I
awesome. Yeah.
took off
Yeah.
at the time. My wife now was my girlfriend, and we lived together in Massachusetts. And I came home and I said, "Hey, honey, I'm moving to Kentucky. I'm leaving tomorrow, and I'd love for you to come with me, but I'm leaving tomorrow." And she, ultimately she did. I was at University of Louisville for about a year, and then Craig Fitzgerald got the head job at South Carolina,
Mhm.
and he hired me right then and there. And same conversation with my wife Shalana. I said, "Hey, I'm moving to Columbia. We weren't married yet at the time. I was like,
Mhm.
I'd love to, for you to come with me, but I'm moving to Columbia and I'm leaving tomorrow." And it was an ice storm in Louisville, and she's like, "Are you kidding me?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm out of here." So
Yeah.
we drove down, and for the first 3 years, Fitz was there. I was, the first assistant for football. It was a great experience working for Steve Spurrier.
Yeah.
And then when Fitz left, it was a funky deal. I
Okay.
was interviewing for a few head jobs at the time, and super fortunate. And then I had one that I was very interested in, and the same day, Fitz called me. He's like, "Hey, I'm going to Penn State," and
Yeah.
um, I recommended you, and Coach Spurrier wanted to talk to you about staying on and being the head strength coach at South Carolina. And so I had to call the other coach and tell him, "Hey, I'm staying where I'm at. This is a
Yeah.
crazy opportunity."
Gotcha.
So I was there for 5 years as the head strength coach. We had a lot of success. We had built the program up over the course of the first 3 years, and then we sort of wrote out some success for the next really 3.5, 4 years before Coach Spurrier kind of hung them up in 2015.
Hmm.
Um, well, Muschamp came in. I was out of a job because he had a guy, and kind of messed around for a couple of weeks until I got connected with Mark Whipple, who was the head coach at University of Massachusetts.
Hmm.
And that was, he was a guy that sort of recruited me way back in the day when he was at UMass the first time, and they were sort of getting that program up to speed in the Division I level. So I went up there. I was there for 2 years. It was great. It's about 2.5 hours from where I sort of grew up, so
Hmm.
we were able to kind of see a lot more family. It was a tremendous experience. I love the athletic department there. The athletic director Ryan Bamford's a good friend of mine to this day. Um, Had a really good experience with Whip, building that culture and building that program. Met a lot of great coaches, and then in 2018, I got a call about Arizona State. Was fortunate enough to get invited for an interview. It was Herm Edwards' first year, and I think I interviewed against 4 or 5 other strength coaches, and me and Herm hit it off
Hmm.
right from the start. And we came out here, and 5 years with Coach Edwards, and now 2 years under our belt with Coach Dillingham.
Hmm.
Um, that transition was a funny story. I can tell that if you want, but
Yeah, absolutely.
it's been a great run. It's been a great experience, and I've grown a lot and tried to continue to learn and grow over the course of time. I don't act like I know everything. I think it's one of those things where if you stop trying to learn and stop trying to grow, then you're going to die, right? And I just it's I'm just so grateful and fortunate to be in the position that we're in.
Yeah. Yeah, there's several things in that initial story to where you are now that I'd like to unpack. And the number one thing is you mentioned you're going through these several jobs. I don't want to say they're odd jobs because when you're working those type of professions, they're not really odd jobs. You're not doing a part-time job at like Costco.
Right.
Then you mentioned you had an epiphany that led you to Bridgewater State. Do you mind sharing what that epiphany was?
Yeah, I literally woke up one morning and I was like, what am I doing? I was probably I don't know, maybe 23, 24.
Mhm.
And I was like, I really want to enjoy what I do as a profession. And my undergraduate degree was in criminal justice and sociology. And I'm like, I don't think I want to do that, you
Yeah.
know? And obviously I was, in the fire department and I'm like, I don't think I want to do this either. And so I called Emil Johnson, who was at University of Hartford at the time.
Hmm.
He actually, I think he might have been at Yale at the time, as the head strength coach. And I was like, hey, how do I do what you do? And I was like, I love training. I always have. I almost enjoyed it more than the sport a lot of the
Yes.
times. I was probably better at it than I was at the sport. And he was like, well, let me spell it out for you. He sort of went through the rundown of like what I would need from a education perspective, from a certification perspective. And it was a great conversation. He's like, here are some of the schools that, you could apply to. I had to beg to get into Bridgewater.
Mm.
I was basically a temp enrollee because my GPA in undergrad was not great. And obviously I didn't have any of the prerequisite classes. So I had to kind of take a semester of the anatomy and physiology and
Hmm.
some of the different prerequisites that I needed. And then I would drive up to Bridgewater, which was another hour in the opposite direction, basically. And I would try to, get FaceTime with, Dr. Robinson before I really knew who she was or
Hmm.
what she was all about. And I'd sit in her office and I'd be like, hey, I really want to do this, I'd take the GRE, all those things. And I guess I convinced her because I got accepted and I had a perfect GPA in my master's program because it was something that I enjoyed. I loved every textbook, every study,
Yeah. Yeah.
every class. I didn't miss a thing. I was all in, and
Hmm.
it was an enjoyable experience. Even though I was working so hard, I loved the curriculum, and it. I just it's almost like it was predetermined. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
it was a thing where I was like, no, this is the new thing. This is what I'm doing now. This is amazing.
Hmm.
And yeah, I can't really convey the feeling there. Like it was a weird deal where it just kind of happened, and
Hmm.
I just again, I'm obviously so grateful that it did, but it was a great experience.
Yeah. And then you mentioned this, so you worked on on a staff that was led by Steve Spurrier, who is regarded
Mhm.
by many as like a goat.
Yeah,
And I gotta ask, is this were you there during the Jadeveon Clowney years?
yeah, yeah. I coached Clowney for 3 years.
Okay,
So
just pure
I
nerd
was there
question.
from I was there from 9 to 15,
Oh
2009 to
yeah,
2015.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
Apex Saves years. I gotta ask as a complete aside nerd question. Do you have any like super awesome freak story of him in the weight room?
I mean, so he got to us as a freshman. I
Hmm.
think he was, you know, 245, 250.
Hmm.
He ran a 4.46 and he had a 41-inch vertical. And this was before a lot of the technology and stuff like that. So then
Right?
the second year, he was 258, 265, and he ran a 4.46 and he had a 41-inch vertical. And then the last year, he was 275, 280, and he ran a 4.46 and he had a 41-inch vertical. Um, he was, as freaky of an athlete as I've ever been around. He had the biggest engine.
Yeah.
One thing we really tried to work on was his suspension, right? Because
Hmm.
he could produce an ungodly amount of force. But ultimately you have to be able to absorb that force in
Yeah.
certain instances. So
Hmm.
that was one thing we tried to focus on. But I remember, he'd flip up a 345-pound clean like cold, like, oh man, I can do that, like, and he just do it. Like he
Just rip
was
it off the deck and just do it.
he was freaky. And on the football field, obviously
Oh,
everybody saw
obviously.
it,
Oh.
he just if it was third down, it was over. It
Yeah.
was over. He's just going to go get the quarterback or go get the running. He's just going to go get him. And he was he was an amazing talent. I still to this day have uh, some ill feelings for all the folks that talked about how he like wasn't in good shape or like took
Hmm.
plays off or whatever. But the guy was the best player on the field, on any field he was on, no matter what.
Yeah.
And he was the first pick in the draft for a reason. Like it, you know, to expect him to do what he was capable of doing every single play is not realistic,
Yeah.
and he was a freak, and I'll always have that dude's back. He was an unbelievable talent and still is. I mean, he's still playing in the NFL.
Yeah. I mean, to that point where people are upset about people taking plays off or it doesn't look like they're giving enough effort, they say the same thing about Myles Garrett. He's doing pretty well.
Yeah,
You
it's
know, I
it's a
mean,
it's
on
a
the whole,
ridiculous
it
it's a
is.
ridiculous media narrative that
Yeah.
they tried to basically like find the flaws in this kid. And he, to his credit, he just
Yeah.
kept playing,
He did.
like he just
Yeah.
kept playing. And this was right around the time where people started sitting out, and I'm going to save myself for this, I'm going to save myself for that. He didn't do that.
Yeah.
He played in our last bowl game. He knew
Hmm.
he was going to be the first pick of the draft. He played in that game. And
Yeah.
it's just, it's a testament to him. He was a ball player.
Yeah. There's one more thing I want to unpack. Then I got to go back to something you just previously said. The last thing I want to unpack in this story is when you went and applied for, got the call to apply for the ASU job.
Mm-hmm.
So you met with Herm. Herm always seems to me like he's going to tell you how it is. He's going to be kind about it, but he's going to be level-headed about it. Do you
Mm-hmm.
think that, in least that's my opinion, when I see him and many others who have spoken to him, do you feel that your background coming from the motherland of New England, that was like, oh, you guys like connected really quick, largely because of that, or is there another factor that I'm unaware of?
No, I think it's probably that. I think our
Okay.
personalities meshed well, and I think our philosophies meshed well. We were talking about we basically were just having a conversation, and we kind of created the mantra, which was words and actions at the time, right? If your words don't align with your actions, then you're doing it wrong, basically.
Hmm.
And he was just he to all his faults, he was a great human being. He was always great to me.
Hmm.
He worked as hard as he knew how. And he was a great motivator. I think our kids were always motivated. I think, the college game was a little different, obviously, and a lot of the different things that happen in college were different for him.
Hmm.
Um, he didn't, we had to sit down and go through the calendar, and he was like, well, when are you off? And I'm like, I'm not, like,
Not
we're
off. We
not
don't go
off,
off. Yeah.
like,
Right.
yeah,
No, we don't get off. We don't.
when are the guys leave? When are they off? I'm like, they're not off. Like, it was just, it was a different thing for him. And but I'll always be super grateful to him. He's if I text him right now, he'd text me back.
Yeah.
He's a great guy. And he was a great person to work for. Ultimately, you know, he got sort of screwed because of some other people's decisions, and
Yeah, we watched it.
it
We
is what
saw
it
it.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody saw it. So
Yeah. And then so next question, which actually is great, parlays into the main course of what I'd like to discuss today, and what I'd like to learn from you. You mentioned Jadeveon Clowney, and that guy is, at least in our lifetime, a top five freak. And you mentioned you had to work on his suspension or absorption
mhm,
of force. Can
sure.
you go into a little bit of your philosophy? You have someone at that level. What do you do to actually increase their suspension, increase their absorption of force? What's your philosophy on that during an off-season period?
Yeah, with him in particular, I think there was a lot of tempos incorporated, right? A lot of slow eccentrics, a lot of things where he was so used to being able to produce force at such a rapid rate that if you train the opposite side of the coin there from a muscle physiology
Hmm.
perspective, you're usually helping him out, right? Because you're creating that foundation. So a lot of deceleration in a controlled environment, in a programmed environment for him, coming to balance, stopping, um, and then holding certain positions for a long period of time. Obviously, that wasn't the only thing we did. Obviously, there was
Hmm.
still, all the other things from a training perspective were still present, but for him, that was something that, he had to focus on a little bit harder just because he was so good at everything else.
What type of isometrics would you have him do, holding positions?
Yeah, in split squat positions, in different
Mhm.
lunging positions, some heel elevated stuff in those positions. The majority of his lower body strength movements would be tempoed, like a 6 second or 7 or 8 second eccentric with a pause,
Mhm.
and then that force application. So
Wow.
just understanding the position and the angle of his body at the time, and just being able to kind of control that body throughout a range of motion, a full range of motion. So that and to be honest with you, a lot of the stuff that, I sort of started with guys like that at a place where we had such, elite athletes. A lot of those things, those philosophies I still incorporate today from an injury prevention perspective.
Okay. When you're working, even with the level of freak as he is, or not so much, but even at that level, they're all good. All the players you're getting are at least good, if not great. So you're talking about like 6, 7 second eccentric with a pause for him. What percentage is on the bar?
In reality, it
Yeah.
depends on, it depended on the week, the phase. I mean,
Okay.
if we're training him for 6 months, it's going to sort of work its way up at that point, right? So
Hmm.
we're going to start out light and make sure that tempo is there and it's abided by, and then as we sort of move through that phase, we can sort of decrease that eccentric tempo,
Hmm.
maybe eliminate the pause. Obviously, the intensity of the exercise is going to increase in the form of load. And that really goes for a lot of different exercises ultimately.
Hmm.
You'd add in halts and pauses on Olympic lifts. You can
Hmm.
you can kind of play with it a lot of different ways to sort of create that ownership of the position.
Yeah. Do you to dictate that? Do you use a bevy of technology to dictate that, or do you go off of your eyes first and you let technology justify what your eyes are seeing?
At the time, I mean, we didn't have, this was, you're talking about early 2010s.
Yeah.
We didn't have a force plate. We didn't have a Nord board. We did have catapult,
Okay.
but it was, the old catapult where you had to call Australia. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a different time,
Yeah.
and we were collecting data, but we didn't know what we were looking at the
Hmm.
time. Um, the only thing we had was a Tendo units for velocity based training.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we would use that quite a bit, but for a lot of that eccentric work, there wasn't, a lot of different options from a technology perspective at the time.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That's how it was James Madison. We didn't have everything that like an Alabama at the time had, because they had that
Yeah,
that Saban money. You know what I mean? So do
right.
what they want.
I mean, ultimately, you can get the job done with your eyes.
Hundred
As a
percent.
good
Hundred
as a
percent.
good coach, you can get your job done
Yes.
with a stopwatch in your eyes, and you know, cueing and counting and understanding what the exercise creates from a stimulus perspective,
Hmm.
right? Because everybody's adapting to that stimulus, and whatever that stimulus is that you want to create, you just make sure that exercise aligns with that stimulus,
Right.
and then you hang on to that for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, and then you
Hmm.
change the stimulus, right, to
Right.
create another adaptation, right?
Right.
It's the same premise. And technology for me just reaffirms sort of some of the philosophies I already know. It's not
Yeah.
a driver of a ton of decision making, although it has been in certain instances, especially
Hmm.
now with a lot of the things we use now. But ultimately, it just reaffirms that what we're doing is actually accurate and the stimulus is correct for what the goal is of the given phase.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. Do you see what I've seen in the last 3 to 5 years, and that would be that coaches who are at this point in 2025 are around 25 to 27 years old or younger. They tend to default to technology first, and then maybe their eyes. Like maybe. Do you see that too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think
Okay. Yeah.
to that point, I think the majority of the interns that we get in or young coaches that we get in are really book smart. They have a
Yep.
lot of knowledge, but they do not know how to apply that knowledge practically in a training environment, and they don't know how to cue. They don't know how to get an athlete to make the lift look like you want it to look like. And to me, a huge portion of what we do in our internship program is try to help develop those guys coaching acumen and understand that, books are great and you need to be educated. And shoot, I read, continue to read to this day, all sorts of different stuff, but it's being able to apply that knowledge in the correct format, the correct structure, the correct setting, so that, you're actually getting the adaptation you want.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm noticing that. I'm noticing that the lack of a better term, and this could be a very grandiose thing to say, but the art of coaching, where it is to your original point, like your eyes and your stopwatch. That's what it involves, and your knowledge is kind of gone with guys who are in their early to mid 20s, where they've grown up on technology anyway, with the
Right.
social media and everything, and now it's just like, well, this technology, it's saying that the bar's not moving faster than 0.65, so we got to adjust it in a way to make it move that. But in reality, they don't know if that athlete is firing correctly, or the athlete had a rough night because the girlfriend broke up with them, or something of that nature. It's like you got John Connor this, you got to defeat the machines. It's going to happen eventually.
Right. And, it's what happens when your Bluetooth goes down. You're just going to cancel the lift. Like
Exactly. That,
what are we talking about?
right.
Like and it's happened, it
Yeah.
happens all the time. And it's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. Or, hey, something's going on with the software in X company's,
Yeah.
system. Like, okay, what are we going to do? Well, we're not going to train the guys. Of course we're going to train them,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's very, it's very much the single most important thing, from a coaching perspective. And you're not going to have all that stuff everywhere you go either,
No,
right? So if you
absolutely not.
rely on a $200,000 a year software system, and you know in this profession you get fired and you end up at a place, you know, name your place that's in the middle of nowhere and doesn't have resources and doesn't have money, what are you going to do then?
Yeah.
Right. So it's, um, yeah, to your point, I think that's very valid.
Yeah. So now we're in the philosophy conversation, which is great. This is what I've been wanting to talk to you about for probably close to 3 years, if I'm being honest with you. Elevator pitch. Your philosophy. I am a 5-star athlete. I'm the best running back to ever come out of high school, which is not true at all. My God. But if I was, pitch it to me. I'm the guy that you want to replace with, or you want to replace Skattebo. Pitch it.
Yeah, I think, my answer to a lot of questions is it depends,
Okay.
because it really depends on what the athlete needs, because what the athlete needs dictates what I should provide. And if I force feed an athlete a given program that I think is right, but it's actually not right, I just wasted time. So for me, being able to sort of weave individuality into a team setting is sort of the art that you were speaking of, right? So if, me and you are squatting, let's say, and, you know, based on some of the things we've seen and based on some of the things we've tested, you need a different stimulus than I need. Those two squats should look different, but
Correct.
we might both be squatting.
Yeah.
And I think that my pitch, with any recruit, is
Okay.
that you're going to get an environment that has all the old school stuff that I think makes strength and conditioning great, like the energy, the effort, the screaming and yelling, all that coaching, but you're also going to get it in a way that benefits you the fastest. And in the age of the portal and college football nowadays, we don't have time to waste
Yes. Yes.
anymore, right? Like you don't have your, 3 to 5 year annual plan with a lot of guys anymore. You have to create a environment that gets the athlete ready for the sport faster. At the end of the day, if a guy enrolls in January, you got 6 months to get him ready. And sometimes that's enough and sometimes it's not quite enough. So you got to kind of do your work on the front end of that too. So, there's still some guys that stick around for a while, and ultimately that that training stimulus for those guys, because we know them so well, probably needs to be a little bit different than some of the new guys, right? So there's a lot of variables in place, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's about every individual athlete getting what they need that aligns with our philosophy in an off-season perspective, right?
Yeah.
So, the old school like hypertrophy before strength
Yeah.
before power, right? There's 1,000 variables of all those, sort of physiological qualities and characteristics, but
Mhm.
and we use them all, right? We're, sort of undulating through
Yeah.
all that stuff, but and then on top of that, you have body composition work, right? So like, you know, am I going to train a guy that needs to lose weight exactly the same way as I'm going to train a guy that needs to gain weight? So there's a lot of variables and nuances in there. And I think that for us, it's something that's really important because we can't waste time. We can't do the old pre-test, 8 weeks later post-test, because what if what we were trying to get accomplished wasn't actually getting accomplished, right? So there has to be checkpoints and set points along the way to validate what the goal of the training phase for that particular athlete might be.
Mhm. So yeah, again, so outside of the traditional hardcore, if you will, strength and conditioning aspects, it really comes down to with you specific needs to the individual to get that individual ready, as opposed to here's a cookie cutter for the bigs and a cookie cutter for the skills, and you guys are gonna train together. It is very much like, well, bigs train together, skills train together, and then in each little group, everyone's gonna have a little bit of adjustment to target specifically what they need. And you won't get this anywhere else because I'm going to give you exactly what you need, the individual, as opposed to what your training partner's doing.
Yeah, and that was always the hard part because trust me, I've done it the wrong way or the other way,
The
right? I,
cookie
I
cutter
shouldn't
way?
say I shouldn't say the wrong way, but the other way, right?
Yeah.
Like I think anybody that's been in this business for long enough, if you're not adapting and changing, then
You're not.
again, it's you're probably not doing your athlete a service. But yeah, and and the hard part for me was always maintaining that camaraderie and structure
Mm-hmm.
of a team environment from a training perspective while incorporating that individuality. So even though we might be doing two different exercises or
Mm-hmm.
the same exercise two different ways, we're still working together. We're still following a cadence. We're still all getting um the same things done at the same times, if that makes sense.
Yeah. In this in your philosophy of this, how do you break the team up once everyone's gotten warmed up or mobilized, activated, however you want to put it? How does it get split up in terms of groups
Sure.
in the weight room?
Yeah, sure. No, we have, the sort of, I don't even want to say old school because, but something I stole from Joe Ken back in the day, we do utilize like sort of a block system in
Okay.
regards to training age. Um, so we have our, developmental block, we have our seal block, we have our delta block, which is front seven and outside the box. And then on top of all that, we have a quarterback block. But at the end of the day, especially this time of year in the early off season, it's very general, right? Like why would everybody sort of needs the same stuff at the beginning. And
Mm-hmm.
then as we get closer to football, that's when you sort of weave in a lot of that individuality that we were talking about. And then the timing of that differs depending on the athlete and their training age and their experience level, and then the data we collect what they need. So
Mm-hmm.
um, it's a moving target, right? It changes as we go.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's, depending on the team, sometimes it would only be 3 or 4 groups, right? And then other times you will have 6 or 7 different, you know, sort of stimulus going on in the weight room at once. But
Mm-hmm.
everybody's on the same cadence. Like I still use a whistle to determine when the next set starts.
Okay.
And it to me it's you have, I don't know, a couple different methods set up at a given time depending on the athlete, but they're still executing those things in a similar perspective, from a team camaraderie perspective.
Yeah. How many athletes in a typical group do you have? Knee jerk? Like how much?
Yeah, we only have 2 groups throughout the day currently in
Okay.
our off season. We'll do right now we're not doing any team runs, but we will incorporate some team runs here in the next probably 3 or 4 weeks. Um, But in the weight room, two groups. So we have our front seven group and our outside the box group. And
Okay.
then within those two groups, there's a couple different variations to that, what's going on.
Okay. How many coaches outside of yourself do you have working the floor?
Four. So we
Four.
have five total.
Okay.
Plus, I think we have five interns right now, four
Okay.
interns right now.
That's a healthy
Um,
group. That's
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So ultimately you're looking at anywhere between, 40 and 55 athletes in a given block. I sort of prefer a larger group because it creates that energy and creates that environment. Shoot, I've tried three groups before. I've tried
Hmm.
four groups before. I've tried one group before.
One group. Oh,
And to me, it's
yeah.
sort of settled on two because you get that big, energetic team environment, but you also get the ability to coach and cue and critique and evaluate guys. It's just not. Now listen, we're rolling, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
we're flying around and you got to hustle as a coach,
Hmm.
but I also like the two groups because it allows you to have a really good plan. You're not truly on the floor coaching. If you have five groups a day, you're coaching for 10 hours a day.
Yes.
That's a little rough on you as a
It
coach because
it is.
then you got to spend another 4 or 5 hours planning for the next day or
Yes.
planning, for 3 or 4 weeks from now. So for us, we've settled on that. We have a great schedule here. It's a morning only schedule, and there's
Mhm.
no our guys don't have class till 12:30, 1 o'clock, and
Oh,
then
nice.
their afternoon is academics, and their morning is football or sports performance. So that really helps that out too.
Absolutely. We can go from that macro perspective down to a micro. You mentioned you're breaking off groups. There was a quarterback group.
Mhm.
Can I get you to chime in on your position when it comes to quarterbacks specifically, horizontal pressing, benching, however you want to define it? What is your philosophy on that? I've heard varying things.
Sure. I mean, so I was a thrower, right? I was
Mhm.
a quarterback and a pitcher, and I have a pretty good understanding of sort of the needs of the throwing mechanics, right?
Okay.
And I've read all the quarterback guru stuff.
Hmm.
I had Tom House's book before he was even
A thing?
training quarterbacks,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He was training Nolan Ryan. He was a pitching guy, and
Yeah.
now he's doing biomechanical analysis of Tom Brady and quarterbacks and all that stuff.
Mhm.
Um, so for me, it's not as limiting as I think a lot of people make it, in
Mhm.
that they should still be strong through all ranges of motion as long as they're moving correctly. We still, during certain periods of time throughout the year, we horizontal press, we overhead press, we do a bunch of different Olympic lifts with them. Obviously, there's a little bit more of a rotational component to a lot of the things they do, but um, and then their mobility is very specific to their position, from a hip perspective, from a T-spine perspective, from a shoulder perspective. A lot of their auxiliary movements are much different than some of the other guys, but not crazy different. But they are different um, because of the nature of the position, the one-dimensional nature of the throwing specific motion. Um, Obviously, a little bit more um, for those guys, a little bit more medicine ball work.
Mhm.
I prefer to train certainly early in the off season when we're not quite throwing as much, the opposite side from a rotational perspective. I like to try to create at least a little bit of balance for those
Yes.
guys when we can, because at the end of the day, during the course of a year, shoot, if a quarterback's throwing 200 footballs 5 days a week for 4 months, there's going to be an asymmetry there.
Oh
And,
yeah.
early in the offseason, we try to give that arm a rest, um, so to speak. We're still throwing, so there's still the specificity in there, but the amount of throws is far less. You can create a little bit more range from a training perspective, just based on my experience. the quarterback sort of lives, and it's almost the same with sprinting, right? Like you live in that like 50 to 80% range from an intensity perspective on a given throw.
Hmm.
So we try to get above that and push that
That
ceiling
needle.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then also below that to, help the technique and a lot of the different things. So again, it's about kind of trying to get the whole range, the whole gamut of potential there and working on the things that maybe you weren't just working on from a throwing perspective.
Yeah, I get that question a lot when it comes to like rotational aspect. I'm glad you brought that up of like quarterbacks and other conversations too, golf, field hockey,
Sure. Yeah.
lacrosse. Same ish type deal in rotation. And if you had to say the off season, peak off season, let's say the 6 months of just off season training, percentage wise, knee jerk reaction, how much rotational work would a quarterback do in your opinion for the opposing direction as opposed to the primary direction?
It's probably 70-30.
I was gonna say seven. Yeah,
It's probably
yeah,
70-30. And
yeah.
and to the point too, like it's a similar philosophy to the one that we spoke about earlier with Clowney, in that we're not producing force that whole time either. Like a lot of that stuff starts slow and controlled and isometric, and then sort of works its way towards that force production, that torque. But over the course of time, right? So they're prepared for that force when ultimately they get to that point.
So coming out of that micro back to the macro, going to the off season, what does a week of training look like for the guys?
Yeah, sure. So our schedule is a 4-day split. We train Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, 2 hours a day, depending on the group.
Okay.
And the first hour of that is always going to be some form of athletic, um, uh, dynamic warm up, activation, form run, and then some form of speed, change of direction, plyometric or conditioning
Mhm.
on a given day. And then the second hour is going to be the weight room. So we train um, depending on the time of year, upper lower split, right? But that
Mhm.
changes as we go. It's really total body every day, but the emphasis is upper lower.
Yeah.
We save the high fatigue, high CNS exercises for the end of the week, so we can get some of the faster exercises completed as fresh as possible.
Hmm.
And I think that's been a pretty good basic model to follow. As we get closer to football in July, we change that up, where typically we're doing some form of field work 5 days in a row,
Hmm.
and the weight room may take a step back to 3 days, three true total body days. But it really depends on the team. Last year we didn't do that. Last year was the first year we didn't do that. We just changed the way we were training in the weight room, but we stuck to the 4-day split.
Hmm.
And that might be something because it worked actually really well moving forward. So yeah, that's sort of the basis for it.
Hmm.
This year is a little different for us. Last year, obviously, we weren't, well, 2 years ago, we weren't super successful. So we had some time off in December, which was unfortunate, but we were able to start our off season a lot earlier.
Hmm.
And we had like 11 weeks
Oh,
before
it's
spring ball.
oh yeah.
So it was a great
Yeah.
training block. There was a spring break in there. And then we were able to train them for 2 more weeks after spring break before we started spring ball.
Yeah.
This year we have 7. So we do 6, spring break, 1, and then spring football. So, and then the summer is always, I like the 5 in summer 1, July 4th off, 3 in summer 2, and then a long weekend, and then we're in camp.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you also like the idea of putting your high intensity, high CNS, high fatigue day at the back end of the week? Because at that point in the week, you can easily see if the guys on the whole are dragging and you can adjust it instead as opposed to having that at the beginning of the week. You put them under the fire, and then the rest of the week they're kind of dragging, and they don't get better to the back end of the week.
Sure. Yeah, it's and that's sort of from a weight room perspective, right? Like,
Yeah.
the exercise that obviously is something that we do on Friday is the squat, right? So it's It can be done fast, it can be done slow, but ultimately it's a challenging exercise. It's axial loaded. Anything that's axial loaded, incorporating the spine, has a higher central nervous system demand.
Mhm.
Um, and we sprint on Monday, we sprint on Tuesday, we do some sprinting on Thursday. And to me, if we were to squat on Monday, if we were to sprint and squat on Monday, then
Yeah.
what are you going to do, athletically on Tuesday? It allows us to push that exercise harder.
Yeah.
It allows us to demand more of that exercise, knowing that the guys are going to have 2 days off after it. And typically they'll come in on Saturday and do some recovery and stuff like that. But it allows us to train, in my opinion,
Yeah.
a lot harder
Yeah.
in that particular exercise and all the other exercises. If the timing of everything is right, that's something I've learned over the years. Is if your timing and placement of exercises isn't conducive to maximizing that athlete's sort of potential and recovery for that given exercise, then it's hard to demand and expect a ton of improvement in that from a timing perspective.
Yeah. Can you go into that a little bit more specific with an example of choice?
Sure. So like, let's say, going back to the previous example, like, I know a lot of programs that squat on Monday, right? And,
Hmm.
they might sprint before it, they might not, or they might try to back that exercise up on Tuesday after really only potentially like 24 hours of rest with something that's high velocity, right? So again, that to me becomes an issue, right? You're not going to, in reality, I know Ben Johnson did it and Vern Gambetta had all that stuff with,
Hmm.
you know, post activation potentiation and all that. That's great. And there's a time and place for all that. But at the end of the day, if you're in a hypertrophy phase, a strength phase, and not so much in a power phase, but if you're in one of those phases and you're squatting with that goal and that adaptation in mind, guys aren't going to be at their best for when you need them to run fast.
Yeah.
So to me, it makes the most sense to be able to maximize each piece of the week
Hmm.
from a demand perspective, essentially,
Yeah.
and put it in the right spot so that you can still get everything you want to get out of it, whether, and what that creates is an expectation for the athletes that every time they step foot on in the weight room, there's really no excuse and they have to give maximum effort.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have force plates there now? Do
Yes,
do
we
you
do.
use them
Yeah.
on Monday coming off a weekend to see where they're at?
Not always.
Okay.
In season, we utilize them quite a bit from a readiness perspective, but typically with the force plates, it's a test, and then we rotate groups through. So essentially, every 2 weeks, they're getting an evaluation on those.
Okay. So this is usually the point where I play a devil's advocate because I just
Mhm.
want to see what you're going to say. But I agree with what you're saying. I'm having like the high intensity day or the high squat day. I know
Yeah,
so it kind of ruins you're kind of ruined my party. But what I want to dive into now from that perspective, talking about your favorite squat, your press, and your hinge for football. So starting with squat, like what bar are you using? What setup are you using? What's your just general philosophy on just the squat in general? Because there was a time, if you remember this, I do, where there was a running thought that the squat was like a dead exercise and it was garbage and it was poo poo. Never bought into it, never understood it. I don't think I ever will. So like I'm always interested to know, especially squat wise, what is your philosophy on the squat? What are you doing with it?
sure. It depends.
Ah,
It
great
dep it
answer.
de it
Great
depends
answer.
on the athlete. It
Okay.
depends on the athlete. It depends on what they need. It depends on their biomechanics. Um, it depends on, the stimulus that we want to create. But ultimately, that pattern has to be present. Regardless of how we get it done. We have guys on, the Kabuki transformer. We have guys on a buffalo bar. We have guys on a straight bar. We have guys that squat high bar, mid bar, low bar. We have guys that front squat. Um, but the bilateral squat to me is sort of the king, right? It's,
Mm-hmm.
it's the best driver for whatever stimulus you're trying to create in a given phase. One of the best, certainly for total body overall strength. We utilize accommodating resistance. We'll utilize velocity-based training. We'll change up, maybe a small stimulus and sort of incorporate maybe a little bit of the West Side sort of philosophy from a rotational perspective with maybe some of our older vets. So it depends, right?
Yeah.
It's all predicated on that. You look at, a guy's femur length. Are we elevating his heel? Are we not? How's his ankle mobility? What's his technique look like? Is he bracing correctly? How can we maximize this particular thing in a given period of time to get the stimulus we want?
Yeah, I mean, that just comes down to, again, what you said in your philosophy is general hardcore stuff, but also specific to the individual when you come to ASU. So let me ask you this. In the squat scenario, do you have a retest lower body? Do you ever do that? Do you ever go through a phase where we're going to retest your specific lift for your squat pattern once or twice a year? Or do you just kind of go on and use your eyes to judge it?
I don't know about everybody else, but I've been really fortunate to um, never have to like be at a spot where the coach necessarily cared if the number changed. I think being able to, I've heard stories of, this guy's, in year 4 and his squat didn't go up 5 pounds, and, the strength coach gets their ass ripped from the head coach because he didn't do his job. Like, I think that's crazy in today's day and age because there's so many other data points and set points that can be looked at to drive improvement. But for us, our particular system, depending on the time of year, we've sort of created a system that, I wrote a book on it. I just haven't got it published, to be honest with you. I've been lazy.
Okay.
It's called FPAS. It's Flexibly Periodized Autoregulatory System. And basically what that means is I can tell you what somebody's max is every week. It doesn't matter. It's a bastardized version of APRE and 531 and with a velocity component and potentially a cluster component that allows you to create a stimulus that you want to create with a given repetition range at a given time. But for our guys, we flirt with failure, technical failure,
Okay.
for a large portion of the year. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it's something that has really driven development for us rapidly. We saw, myself and my staff at UMass sort of created this. It was an idea, in my later years at South Carolina, and then, going to UMass, I had some time to kind of create this sort of model and philosophy. And you got to be smart with when you do it and how you do it and how you vary it and progress it. But I think our guys get a lot of benefit from it. I remember, reading Brian Mann's book talking about APRE, and I think the first sentence was, "This is the fastest way to get strong." And I had my own issues with APRE and the way they set up their warm-up sets and how it works, but we stole some stuff from them, from whoever it was that created APRE, and in Eastern Europe, and took a lot of the 531 principles from Wendler and created our own, where there's, depending on the day, depending on the deal, there could be 1+ set, there could be 2+ sets, and the previous week's plus set dictates the next week's load. So for us, for a large portion of the year, we don't utilize percentages at all. It's based on the previous week. So to answer your question, we're testing every week. It's not a thing where we have to me, it never made sense to use a max that was, accomplished a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months ago for the given training set of the day. I always had just I'm like, we got to figure this out. This doesn't make sense. Like, okay, well, we're going to take 90% of the max they got, last summer, and we're going to use that in season. Well, that
That,
doesn't make any sense. That's
no.
that's not auto-regulatory in any capacity, right? Because you don't know what the given athlete's walking in the door with and like. And so to me, this was kind of the way to kind of create that.
Yeah, I tell some people all the time, and it sounds as though you're in the same mindset. And if I'm wrong in assuming this, you gun me down real quick. Don't you can't hurt my feelings, coach. It ain't gonna happen.
Okay.
So I always tell people this. They reference multiple books to me, and then they reference double the amount of problems they're having with their athletes. And I say to myself, like, well, I say to them, after I say to myself, I say, self, well, are you using these books as absolutes? Because this book was not written by you based on your knowledge, based on your athletes, based on your environment, whether it is physical or elemental. Like here in the cold north, I gotta spend 15, 20 minutes warming my guys up before
Mhm.
we even get anywhere. Down there, you get close to spring, it's not gonna take as long. Like they're completely different scenarios. And then
Sure.
does that make sense? Did you agree with that? If not, gun me down.
No, you're absolutely right. And shoot, I learned that, the hard way by doing it that way early in my career. Like,
Well,
no, we're following 5-3-1 to a T, and there is no variation, right? And not to say that that's not a good thing, but every situation's different. Every athlete's different. Every training facility is different. Every climate is different. And there's so many variables that we have to account for
right.
in a given training phase. Every team is different.
Yes.
I am not somebody that, myself and my staff sit down every December and we throw out everything we did and we start over,
Yeah.
and plan the next year because it's a different team. It
Hmm.
might require something different. It might be different motivational tactics. It might be different exercises. We might have had a particular issue the previous year. What part of the bodies do we want to attack a little bit more? Where do we want to, spend most of our time from a pre-ab perspective, from a physiological, demand perspective? Like, what do we need to get stronger? Do we need to get more powerful? Do we need to get bigger? Do we need to lose fat? Do we need to gain fat? Like, there's so many variables. And to me, the old open the file, change the last number to the next number and cut and paste and save it and then
Yeah.
print it out and go is crazy. And
Oh, it's asinine.
I just never prescribe to that. I think the athletes deserve more than that
Mhm.
from us. And yeah, it doesn't mean. I was just talking with a former assistant this morning about that, and he's like, oftentimes after 2 weeks of meeting for 6 or 8 hours a day, we'd end up in the same spot. But at least we all believe that, oh, okay, this is the right thing, right? We be meticulous about the evaluation of it because if the evaluation's correct and your staff's involved, maybe there's an idea, right? Or hey, maybe there's something else we can change or tweak. And the foundation of the program might look similar, but there's some wrinkles and things that are different because the team's different, the athletes are different, they're older, or they're a new crew. I
Hmm.
mean, the first year with Coach Dillingham, we had 62 new players on our roster.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So I didn't know any of them, and so we had to get to know them, and we had to figure out how they moved, how their physiology worked. Right? Are they a guy that can produce force? They're a guy that needs more time on the ground, or they're a guy that needs more strength, or a guy that needs more power? And then how do we weave that in to work backwards from football and make sure they're ready for football? That is the job, right? In a
Yeah.
nutshell, in a given time. And I've always tried to do my due diligence with that plan. And then on top of that, you might have to deviate from that plan at some point in
Oh
time.
yeah.
Like it's
Oh yeah.
not set in stone.
Oh.
It's something that is a guideline and a plan. And on a given day, you might have to deviate from that plan. So, and really, what that comes down to is using your eyes, right? That's that art of this thing that we do.
That's all I was gonna say. It's the art of coaching. You just described the art of coaching so eloquently. You did. No. And and what you're saying where teams can be different, the environment you're at is different, the schools are different. It's not unsimilar to when I spent time in the military. And you go from Fort Knox to Fort Campbell to Fort Bliss. Like there are different battle rhythms, and some guys, some companies, some battalions, they're bred to kill, and
Mm-hmm.
they live their life to kill. And you can push the needle, and some of them just aren't, and you got to find ways around it. So I mean,
Right.
it's no different from that aspect to the NCAA where you got to play around with that. One more piece, just to go back a little bit, but to finish up the subject of squatting. I've come across more coaches in the last 5 to 7 years who are becoming more and more pro towards the box squat than they used to be. Are you pro or against box squatting? I'm not going to hate you either way.
I am pro anything that accomplishes the goal
Yeah.
of creating the stimulus that we want.
Hmm.
And, I think box squat was really popular when I was first starting out in this profession.
Okay.
And then it sort of went away. And now maybe it's coming back. I
Hmm.
don't know.
Yeah.
We've incorporated it at given training phases throughout the year. I will say that box squats done correctly
Hmm.
is the most important thing to discuss because to me, I mean, I first learned to box squat. I was super fortunate. I went to a clinic. John Sisk ran the clinic when he was at Vanderbilt, and Louis Simmons was there. And so I got a chance to learn how to box squat from Louis Simmons.
Yeah.
Now that's one way to do it,
Yeah.
right? Now he was super, he had a lot of success doing it
Yeah.
his particular way.
Right.
But those guys also had some issues, right? Like
A
they
little
had some
bit.
hip flexor stuff. They,
Yeah.
not to mention some of the different things they were doing to help facilitate a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
So what I've come to is for me, a box squat essentially just lengthens the amortization phase
Hmm.
and all the concentric force that's built up is gone. It's lost in that, or excuse me, the eccentric.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And
Right.
then that
Stretch reflex.
amortization, yeah,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
amortization phase is long. So it's all force related and it's starting strength. It's, trying to facilitate type 2 muscle fiber stimulus and all those
Hmm.
different things. And it's a great exercise for positioning.
Yeah.
Um, we still utilize it. The one thing I don't like is when people touch and go on a box squat. I think
Correct.
that
Yeah.
is not very smart because you think about a spinal cord. If you're loaded on one side of the spinal cord and then you load on the other side of the spinal cord, now you're getting a compressive force that's a lot higher on an exercise like that. So I see that all too often, and it is one thing that I don't understand is the old touch and go and guys smashing down on the box. Like
Yeah.
I was always taught you're supposed to sit on the box like it's a bed of nails,
Yeah.
and you don't let any stiffness of your core musculature out. You have to utilize that, barely touch it like it's a dozen eggs, like it's a bed of nails, whatever you want to say, where you're just basically feather touching it. You're allowing your body to do what it does when it stops. And then you're learning how to apply force in a given way from that exercise. So
Yeah.
I will say it's not a primary for us,
Okay.
but some of our older athletes, some of our guys that need a little bit more starting strength, do utilize that from time to time.
Yeah. I find that to be a great tool in season, especially just to reduce time under tension if I still have them squat. Uh, when you made mention of coaches or athletes you're watching and they're doing it and they're going down and they're slapping it and they're coming back up. That to me is one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen in a weight room. I've seen some crazy stuff, as I'm sure you
Yeah.
have. That to me, and you watch an athlete do that with 300 plus pounds in their back and then complain about their back's in pain. And then the strength coach says, we're not going to do it because it causes back issues. And I watch them do that. And I think to myself, I don't know what you're seeing that I'm not seeing. Like, I don't understand how you think that's like, how you justify allowing that to happen and thinking that's
Mhm.
correct. Because
Right.
if I told you, Coach Connolly, let's put 405 on your back, and I want you to Liu Xiao Jin to this box and just dive bomb it, nail it, and try to pop up, would you think in your mind that's a good decision?
No, no,
No,
I wouldn't.
no, no. And yeah. So I'm glad you said that because that's the biggest thing I see with the box squat. Whatever stance you're using, whatever methodology you're thinking about, that's the biggest issue I see. So
Yeah,
going off that, yeah,
it's a
sorry.
terrible thing. Terrible
Oh, it's a
thing.
terrible
And
thing.
the exercise in itself is not the problem.
No, no, it's not. And so to watch that happen, and I watch coaches like just completely remove it because they don't understand the mechanics of it, and I don't understand why they don't understand the mechanics of it. And then when I explain it to them in very, very basic terms, they start slowly putting it back in, and it starts working for them again. Not running it all the time because they're not geared, lifters. They need to
Right.
have, free catch and release. But
Hmm.
when it comes to pressing, what's if you look at the totality of the year, what's the major press you use?
It depends.
I know, but you're
We
killing me here, though.
we use them. We
Yeah.
use them all.
Okay.
Every one of them.
Okay.
Every one of them you could think of. We horizontal press. We vary up the implement. We vertical press. We vary up the implement. We, um, use incline, low incline, all the different variations that you can think of. We do.
Mhm.
And I'm a big believer in the overhead press and all presses.
Okay.
The one thing that we always try to do is double up the pulls with the presses. I think
Yeah.
that's something that, a long time ago I learned that's important. And there's a lot of different ways to pull. Like, a lot of people count a pull, it has to be the same plane or whatever. Like there's just balancing out that, and that goes for anything, right? Like everybody always talks about balancing out pressing and pulling. Well, that goes for your lower body too, right? You
Oh,
got to balance out your quad and your hamstring. You got to balance out your hip and your hip flexor, your glute and your hip flexor. You got to balance out your pec and your back. Like you have to balance out everything. That's part of what we do.
yeah. It all comes down to what's behind the head,
Mhm.
the whole posterior chain. That's what it comes down to. Like I just had a conversation with the coach the other day about this. I told her it's like I have never heard a strength coach ever tell me, "Gee, this athlete's hamstrings are too strong." Have you ever heard? I've never heard that. I've
No,
never had that issue. And
no,
like the stronger you get everything behind the ears, the stronger you're gonna be in front, anteriorly. Just, I
typically,
mean,
yeah.
yeah. Uh, when it comes to hinging, it depends. But once you're done with it, depending, are you more of a fan of, on the whole, using a trap bar or like an actual deadlift bar, stiff bar, straight bar?
Both.
Yeah, great. Tell me
I
why.
think I
Yeah,
think it depends on the training phase and what we're trying to get accomplished. To me,
yeah.
the trap bar deadlift is a lot more similar to the squat than
Okay.
it is the conventional deadlift. I also really like the RDL. I think the RDL is, in particular for the big guys, is probably the greatest, what probably secondarily the greatest lower body exercise that they can do. If they get really strong in the RDL
Oh,
and a lot of the single leg variations of that, then they're going to be a really good they're going to have a really good foundation for everything else you do moving forward. I We utilize the trap bar quite a bit during certain phases, but again, that to me, at least depending on the athlete's biomechanics, is a lot more quad dominant than it is posterior chain dominant.
yes.
When that load is actually on the front side of your body,
Mhm.
that's a different that's a different thing. For example, like in season with our skill guys, I think our first 4 week phases, we had, a squat in there, a form of a squat. And then the last 2 4 week phases for us, it was a trap bar. So to me, that trap bar is a lot more similar to a squat than it is, a deadlift or an RDL.
Yeah, when you bring that trap bar in, how do you vary the squat on the back end or front end, back end? Like, how do you double dip those if you're getting more quad drive out of that trap bar in your philosophy? How do you balance that?
Meaning what? I'm sorry, I
So,
don't.
okay, so if you're doing trap bar, say at the beginning of the week,
Mhm.
and you're squatting middle to end of the week, and they're both quad or thigh leg extension dominant. How are you modulating that so they don't get overtrained, or they don't start getting knee pain, however.
Sure. Yeah, no, so to your point, typically we wouldn't do that.
Okay. Okay.
But if we did, because I have in the past,
Okay.
the majority of our auxiliaries would be the opposite, right? So, you have an Olympic strength major for us, you'd have a strength major or some, strength related exercise as the
Mm-hmm.
second major. And then you have a bunch of auxiliaries. The majority of our auxiliaries and medley sets and all the rest would be the opposite of that, in a perfect world. But,
Mm-hmm.
we probably wouldn't do that. Typically it's, an anterior day and a posterior day.
Okay.
However you want to accomplish that.
Okay. When you're taking that trap bar and you're mixing that with like hinging and RDLs, I'm so excited you said RDLs. Is in my opinion a properly executed RDL, however you want to load it, however you want to think about it, I think is the most underutilized primary strength developer there is for athletics. No
Yeah.
one really drives an RDL. If you get nasty at a good locked in RDL, you can pick up whatever you want off the deck. It's pretty much locked in. Good mornings become locked in. Squats become more manageable. Knees become healthier. Their triple
Hmm.
extension goes through the roof.
Yep.
When you're looking at RDLs, what's your favorite type of progression? How long do you stick with that variation of RDL you're doing? And how are you a fan of like loading it for those 3 to 6 weeks?
I think for us, early in the off season, it's a little bit more unilateral. And then it sort of melts into a little bit more bilateral. That might be the opposite for some coaches. Um, but to me, obviously, for the most part, you can move more weight bilaterally than you can unilaterally. But your technique has to be better unilaterally, and that cleans up a lot of the technical deficiencies bilaterally. So it's a progression right now with this particular team, that we're training. Our big group is a veteran laden group. We have a lot of veterans that have been with us for more than 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
They understand training. It's a very good group. So we actually started with uh, a traditional barbell RDL, and again, to kind of go back on, we're doing a 6 second eccentric, a 1 second pause, and then a concentric. And the load is really predicated on how they look. Um, Obviously, we utilize a lot of our strength exercises, during certain times of year. We do utilize percentages, but sometimes we don't. The one thing with the RDL is I personally have experienced that high volume RDLs, in particular, high volume hamstring, usually creates a little bit more issue than, like, say, high volume quad work. We tend to stay more in the strength realm with that, um, for the majority of our groups that are doing that stuff. That's not to say that we don't push the volume up, but I remember Charles Poliquin telling me that a long, long time ago, and in my own personal experience training for powerlifting,
Mm-hmm.
I felt that,
Yeah.
so right now we're doing 5 sets of 6 with that tempo. The next week will be 5 sets of 6 with that same tempo, but a heavier intensity. And then the week after that, it's down to 6 sets of 5 with a little bit quicker tempo. So maybe a 4 second lower or a 3 second lower. The intensity will increase. And then ultimately, I think on our card right now, week 4, we'll actually do a little bit of a rep out set, that flirts with technical failure. Now, you do have to be careful on a hip hinge in particular with that, because if there is any wiggle from a technical perspective, that set's over. So again, that's something that we'll have to really keep a close eye on as a staff, which we typically do. But ultimately that gives us a really good idea of what they are capable of in that exercise for the next, sort of training block as we get closer to spring ball the last 4 weeks.
Mhm. Do you feel that higher volume hamstring work as comparison to quad work, what do you think is the primary driver for hamstring high volume being a hindrance versus quad higher volume being a hindrance?
I mean, from a physiology perspective, maybe there's, the quad has four muscles and the hamstring doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
something like that might be the driver. It's the same thing for the tricep and the bicep.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that could be it. I'm not an exercise physiologist, so I'm not exactly sure, but a lot of that is anecdotal experience.
Yeah.
That's not to say that some of the lower intensity auxiliary hamstring exercises aren't, a little bit higher volume, but for me, the hamstring exercises that you really want to drive that strength stimulus with, typically, we might start with a squat exercise that's, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 reps, but with a hamstring, it'd be 4, 6, 8, somewhere in there,
Okay.
so maybe, not necessarily half, but maybe 70% of, what you're doing with your quad.
Well, Coach, I know it is Saturday. I do want to get you out of here at 90 minutes. I know you got meals to eat, you got people to crush, got boys to make men. Two questions.
Yeah.
One of them I asked every strength coach comes on. You have your guys one time a week in the off season. That's all you get to see them. The training session can be as long as you want, but it's got to be congruent in one training session.
Mhm.
What does that look like? Bang for buck.
Sure. That's actually pretty easy for me.
Okay.
We would start on the field.
Yep.
We would do a dynamic warm up,
Mhm.
typically a deflex. We would do some form of activation, some form of form run, so some sprint mechanic work, preparing the body. We would do, if it's early off season, we would do sort of low intensity rapid response plyometrics. Then we would sprint,
Okay.
given distance, whatever you
Yeah.
want to say.
Okay.
We do X amount of reps in the sprint. Then we do some form of change of direction from a program perspective where there was a deceleration component and then a reacceleration component. If it's programmed, it could be a cone drill, it could be an open field drill, something like that. After that, we'd go in the weight room. We would do cleans, Olympic cleans. We would bench press. We would squat. We
Mm.
would do probably 2 or 3 auxiliary exercises, both upper and lower,
Okay.
balancing things out.
Yep.
And then we would finish with some conditioning. Depending on the time of year, would determine what that looked like. The further we are away from football, the longer duration we would run. I still believe, and I know that everybody goes back and forth on this. It's a huge battle, but in particular early off season, I still believe that your aerobic foundation is important.
Mhm.
I think that we're training anaerobic athletes and the sport is anaerobic. However, from my perspective, from a recovery perspective, still touching that aerobic part in very brief instances, certain times a year, really helps facilitate a really good foundation for your anaerobic work capacity threshold. I know that's not part of the perfect day, but I wanted to say that because I
It's
don't
okay.
want to hear
It's all
about it.
right. Yeah.
We would do some form of conditioning post exercise, and then we would recover. We would do some low intensity static stretching, and then we would do, inversion, 2 minutes legs up, 3 minutes legs up, something to flush the system,
Mhm.
and then they would go eat.
Okay. You know, I'll say one thing. When you were talking about just how we are working with anaerobic athletes, and I think it was like around 2010-ish, it was a really hot topic where they're football players, they're playing from 4 to 6 seconds. That's the average play time. That's you condition them. Maybe you condition them from 6 to 9, so they go a little bit beyond, but you don't touch anything over that. I understand that. I also believe, much of you've just said, and I've talked to other coaches as well, where in the offseason, you have to create a base for their heart, just their heart to be able to handle the training stimulus that you want to build up to so they can get in shape to then train, to then do that. Uh, Second question, last question. complete nerd question. Got to ask it because I know a lot of people I talk to want to know this as well. What is Skattebo squat?
He's a big squatter.
Oh, I know.
He's a squatty fella. Um,
Yeah.
he's a 400-pound Olympic cleaner. He'll squat. You know, the first year we took him up pretty good. 600-pound squatter fairly easily.
Fairly
Um,
easily.
that was a rep out. I think he did 5 or 6 reps with, you know, 550, 565, something like that. This past year, with the weight loss that we helped him with, he
Yeah.
really cleaned up his body. So
Hmm.
you know, 2 years ago, he was in the 230s.
Hmm.
This past year, he was in the 220s, almost. I think at the start of the year, he was about 218.
Yeah, high teens, yeah.
So, um, mass moves mass at the end of the day.
Mm.
So our goal for him wasn't exactly max strength because we knew he had that. It was more field work velocity. We were trying to increase his speed, and he did that quite a bit. I think he hit 20 miles an hour this year,
Mm.
10 times in a game.
That's great.
Um,
So,
and that was our primary goal. He was also able, from a conditioning perspective, to not take a bunch of plays off.
yeah.
Like the previous year he did a bunch of stuff, but he was a lot bigger. You're
Yeah.
try to go out and go for a run with a weight vest on and see how it
Right.
feels versus no weight vest, right?
Right.
It makes a difference. So he really did a tremendous job from a nutrition perspective, from a sleep perspective, from a recovery perspective to get that going. But he is a strong dude. He's got great angles. He's got great awareness. I I can't really tell you anybody that I've been around that has that sort of balance on contact. And then that reacceleration after contact. I've trained a lot of really good running backs and a lot of really good players, and he is as elite in that as I have ever seen.
Yeah.
Um, it's truly amazing, and I think his hard work really paid off. One thing I want to say about the aerobic piece,
Yes.
um, the reason why, and I've gone back and forth on this over the years. One of the main reasons why I believe that it's still important. I don't know if anybody's read a lot of Joel Jameson stuff. I really like his stuff, but um, me personally, anecdotally, I had, being an Olympic lifter and then a power lifter and doing strongman. I had a ton of patella tendonitis issues, right?
Hmm.
And then during COVID, I was sort of searching for something. The strength stuff was always easy. I wasn't an endurance athlete by any means, never have been. And during COVID, I read freaking David Goggins' book, and I started running, and I ran, and I was running like crazy. I was still training and lifting,
Hmm.
and I was running, and I had a really good system. I was running basically 3 days a week. I would, do a bunch of different things, and I was still getting some, sprint work in and all that stuff. But what I noticed was all my aches and pains went away. And this is at the time I was 39 or 40. Um, and all that stuff went away. And I'm 240, 245 pounds. And I was running, 8, 10, 12. I ran a marathon. Like I did a bunch and I felt better physiologically
Hmm.
after doing that and still training than I did without it and just training.
Yeah.
And that was really eye opening for me. So, like, when everybody's like, well, the offensive linemen don't need to, well, maybe, but maybe there is a benefit to that. And I don't really necessarily know the physiology behind it. I don't know if it's blood flow. I don't know what the physiology is behind that. I'm just telling you anecdotally that all that stuff that I dealt with for years is gone and it hasn't come back.
Yeah.
And I I attribute it to just some of that long duration, low intensity running, to be quite honest.
Yeah. Have you ever read Born to Run?
I haven't yet. No, I need
Okay,
to.
totally worth it. He's written the second one too. Totally worth it. That everything you're talking about, he explains much of that
Does it? Yeah, I got to read it then
in the book.
because that.
It's a good book, easy read. It's a good book. It's not gonna You're not gonna delve into like the deep fleshy physiology portion, but
Yeah,
it helps to really explain like this is why you feel better. Your bodies were made to do this. This is why. And again, a big shtick of it is barefoot, but a lot of it also is, I also squat barefoot. I have a lot of people, all my guys do a lot of things barefoot because there's planted the deck. Uh, Coach, I appreciate you spending time with us, sitting down, chopping it up. Love to have you on again because there's a lot of things that I still want to talk to you about. Is there
sure.
anything you want to say to anyone out there who is looking to get where you are? What would you have liked to have known 20 years ago?
I think it's probably a cliche answer, but you have to continue to work where you are and not worry about always have your goal in mind as something you want to attain, but be the very best at what you're doing when you're doing it. Have a really positive mindset and a really positive outlook. Sometimes that's hard with the early mornings and the schedule and all that stuff, but ultimately your athletes see that. I think energy is very much felt before it's seen. And I think that, you know, just taking your time and not being in a rush with what you want to do, moving around for an extra 10 grand or whatever it is, or, like you just have to really be patient with your process in your career. Um, Shoot, when I got to South Carolina, I wasn't ready to be a head strength coach. I thought I was, but then when you get the hat on, you're like, holy crap, this is a lot. I didn't realize I had to deal with all these different variables. Um, and then constantly reevaluate yourself. I think that there has to be some time for reflection in anybody's career at any given time, whether that's, once a week, once a month, once every few months, but there has to be some time for reflection and reaffirmation for ultimately what you're trying to do. Um, you know, Looking back, I think that's something that I probably could have done a better job of, and I do a little bit more now than certainly I did then, because I realized that it's important. It's an important component for your development as a person, as a coach, as a husband, as a father, as an athlete, whatever that may be. I think um, just sitting in your thoughts and thinking about what the goal is, how the week went, how's everything else outside of that. Like it's very similar to what we talked about from a training perspective. Like there's so many variables that have to be considered in your career as well as your programming. And I think that a lot of those things, especially with young coaches, they sort of lose sight of that.
All right, Coach. We're gonna let you go. If you can stick around for like 2 minutes, we're gonna
Yeah,
get a little onesie twosies from you, and we'll get you on. I appreciate your time, sir.
thanks, Joe. Appreciate you, man.
Absolutely.